From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
An important moment in the Ukraine war comes Friday as 50 donor nations meet in Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany to discuss the next steps in aid to Kyiv as the war approaches its first anniversary on February 24. Will the U.S. and Europe increase their aid, including battle tanks, and how will that affect the war that has become a brutal stalemate in Ukraine's east and south? Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot, here with my Wall Street Journal colleagues, Kate Batchelor-Odell and Jillian Melcher, who have been covering the debate over military aid and the war from the U.S. and London. Welcome to you both. This meeting in Germany, a big event, debate going on, a lot of preparation for what further military aid will be provided. Let's listen to Ukraine President Vladimir Zelensky this week talk about the need for battle tanks.
Mobilization of the world must outpace the next military mobilization of our joint enemy. The supplying of Ukraine with air defense systems must outpace Russia's next missile attacks. The supplies of Western tanks must outpace another invasion of Russian tanks. The restoration of security and peace in Ukraine must outpace Russia's attacks on security and peace in other countries.
All right, Kate, what are the stakes here as the donor nations meet in Germany?
Well, Paul, I think what we're going to see is what is going to be the U.S.'s strategy for the next 6 months in the war. Are we going to provide them the tools that they need to not merely hang on, but win? And are we going to seize a limited opening that we have that Russia is still regrouping, still trying to generate some more forces in both manpower and weapons, but they are trying to launch a new offensive in the east. And
this is Russia.
Russia is trying to launch a new offensive in the east. And so there is this sort of narrow window of opportunity for the Ukrainians to sort of seize the initiative of the war before it grinds into a complete stalemate. So the question, I think, for Ramstein is what are we going to do about that? And the tanks have attracted most of the attention. We have had Germany say, well, we're not going to provide our Leopard tanks unless the U.S. provides its Abrams tank, which is just an embarrassment to all parties involved. But the truth is that the Ukrainians need a tank at scale rapidly. The Russian tank advantage is enormous and their Soviet stocks are deep. The Ukrainians have been able to do some good work against Russian tanks with javelins and other sort of asymmetric capabilities, but they need a tank of their own to go toe-to-toe with the Russians. And they probably need at least 100 Leopard, those are the German tanks, to make a real effect on the battlefield. And so I think what we'll see is whether we're serious about providing that ability at scale and rapidly for them to take this opening that they have this spring.
So the British announced this week they're going to deliver 14 of their Challenger tanks, which is a very useful weapon, but 14 is not exactly an overwhelming number. In this really kind of crazy dance where the Germans say, well, we'll deliver the Leopards, but only if you Yanks give us the cover, I guess, what you would call it, the political cover of delivering the Abrams. Why, number one, Jillian, do you know why the Germans are so reluctant to turn over the Leopards? And why do they need, Germans are part of NATO, why they need the U.S. to provide their tanks when the U.S. is delivering far and away the most military aid across multiple weapon systems?
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. I mean, if you break down the numbers, whether it's by GDP or absolute share of military contributions, Germany has really lagged far behind the United States. As far as an explanation, I think that European countries have been very skittish, very concerned about escalation, but that argument doesn't really hold. I mean, if you're afraid of Vladimir Putin using a nuclear weapon, I think Ukrainians think that's a risk that they took when they decided to take on a nuclear power. And at the same time, I mean, it's really horrific to watch the Ukrainians fighting with a slow drip of military aid when if they were provided more, they could potentially move toward victory much more quickly. What this means is more military casualties. You know, I was meeting with a Ukrainian journalist today who was telling me about how many friends she knows who have gone to the front who've fought, who've now lost an eye, now lost a limb. But it also means a really high civilian casualty toll. And I think that's what we saw this week with the attack on the building in Dnipro. 40 civilians at least killed. It's just really horrific. And I think it is forcing, in a way, the question, is the West willing to provide what Ukraine needs to win this war, or is it just going to provide enough for this to become a very prolonged and painful conflict?
Well, the German ambivalence is continuing. I mean, you had in the immediate wake last year of the Russian invasion, you had this recognition, it seemed at the time by Olaf Scholz, the chancellor, that their whole defense posture needed to change. They had got a new awakening. They're going to invest a lot more in defense. They could no longer make themselves hostage to the Russians on energy. And they were going to work with NATO to both shore up NATO and provide aid to the Ukrainians. But there's been this incredible reluctance to really go all the way with that. And I guess the symbol of that, one symbol of that, was the hapless Defense Secretary Christine Lambrecht, who once boasted that Germany was sending Ukraine 5,000 helmets, all of 5,000 helmets, I guess, so they could die with their helmets on. And she has now been replaced this week after a forgettable tenure by Boris Pistorius, a new defense minister. And he's the one meeting with Lloyd Austin, our defense secretary, and the rest of the Ukraine contact group this week. And one hopes that there's a turn for the better by Germany. But Kate, there's the fundamental reluctance here, the same as it's always been since the beginning, which is they don't want Ukraine to lose, but they also aren't sure they want Russia to lose. They don't want to give too much aid, because maybe then Ukraine will start to push Russia out of Ukraine, and Russia's reaction will be to escalate.
Right. I mean, we've seen the same inventory of excuses here for not providing all sorts of different stuff, like a Patriot missile system. We said, well, the training's too complex, so we waited, 9-10 months to offer it, and then we had to get started on the training anyway, so we just lost those months. We're seeing some of that with the Abrams tanks as well, saying, well, the sustainment tail, the maintenance, the operations of these tanks, it would take too long, it would be too difficult. But those problems are solvable if the Pentagon has the political will to do it. You can run maintenance operations in Germany. You can make savvy use of contractors. There's plenty of ways to overcome those problems if we wanted to do it. So I think, to your point, this is really concern about not pushing Putin too far, and it's really what they call in the Pentagon self-deterring behavior, by worrying about how he would react. And I think what we've learned over the past 10 months about him is that he's going to make the decisions, for instance, on whether to use a tactical nuclear weapon, on whether he perceives it will benefit him on the battlefield. It is not going to be made based on what NATO does. And I would note, a lot of the time he's really had a big bark, but for instance, in the deal to move food through the Black Sea and other places, we've seen him back down and not really follow through. So I think the U.S. should do the right thing here, which is provide the weapons at scale and not be so driven by his reaction.
Jillian, what are you hearing in Europe? You have been in Davos here talking to some of the Europeans. I know that the Ukraine war is one of the top issues there. Is it really the kind of reluctance that Kate talks about, which is fear of escalation? We did have Dmitry Medvedev, one of the Vladimir Putin's main henchmen, say this week that if Russia loses, there is a threat of nuclear war. It's not a new threat. That's been the threat they've said persistently, but he repeated it. Is that what we're talking about? What are the Europeans saying?
Yeah, it's been very interesting in Davos. I was talking to an NGO guy who works in Ukraine, and he was saying that business executives and political leaders are willing to give their moral support, but when it comes to writing a check, it's a little bit tougher. And I think that's kind of the risk here. I mean, I guess in the back of Europe's mind is the question of whether Europe as a whole is safer with an appeased Putin or with a Putin that loses. And I would certainly make the case that a Putin that loses is a much safer Putin to deal with, because I think that he is taking note of how the Western response has been ambivalent, how there are some contradictions in thinking, how this has been very hesitant. And one risk that you run from that approach is that he will feel emboldened and that he will understand that he can take territory with that. I guess he has seen significant consequences in the form of sanctions, but a complete military loss is a much more significant consequence and a much more effective deterrent.